U.S. national security expert urged to no more weapons for Ukraine in New York Times. This is what the security experts are urging. No more weapons for Ukraine. This is via Consortium News. Last week, the New York Times published a full-page advertisement signed by 15 U.S. national security experts about the war in Ukraine, and it was headed, "The U.S. should be a force for peace in the world," and it was drafted by the Eisenhower Media Network. While condemning Russia's invasion, the statement provides a more objective account of the crisis in Ukraine than the U.S. government or New York Times has previously presented to the public, including disastrous U.S. role in NATO expansion, the warnings ignored by successive U.S. administrations, and the escalating tensions that ultimately led to the war. The statement calls the war an unmitigated disaster, quote unquote, and urges President Joe Biden and the Congress to end the war speedily through diplomacy, especially given the dangers of military escalation that could spiral out of control, they said. This call for diplomacy by wise, experienced former insiders, U.S. diplomats, military officers, and civilian officials would have been a welcome intervention on any one of the past 442 days of this war, yet their appeal now comes at an especially critical moment in the war. On May 10, President Zelensky announced that he is delaying Ukraine's long-awaited spring offensive to avoid unacceptable losses to Ukrainian forces. Western policy has repeatedly put Zelensky in near impossible positions, caught between the need to show signs of progress on the battlefield to justify further Western support and arms deliveries, and on the other hand, the shocking human cost of continued war, represented by those tens of thousands of Ukrainians now lie buried. Now, it's not clear how a delay in the planned Ukrainian counterattack would prevent it leading to unacceptable Ukrainian losses when it finally occurs, unless the delay in fact leads to scaling back and calling off many of the operations that have been planned. Zelensky appears to be reaching a limit in terms of how many more of his people he's willing to sacrifice to satisfy Western demands for signs of military progress to hold together the Western alliance and maintain the flow of weapons and money to Ukraine. Boris Johnson's role? Zelensky's predicament is certainly the fault of Russian invasion, but also of his April 2022 deal with the devil in the shape of the then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Johnson promised Zelensky that the UK and the collective West were in it for the long run, quote unquote, and would back him to recover all of Ukraine's former territory just as long as Ukraine stopped negotiating with Russia. That was what Johnson told Zelensky. Johnson was never in a position to fulfill that promise, and since he was forced to resign as prime minister, he has endorsed a Russian withdrawal only from the territory it invaded since February 2022, not a return to pre-2014 borders. Yet that compromise was exactly what he talked Zelensky out of agreeing to in April 2022, when most of the war's dead were still alive and the framework for peace agreement was on the table at diplomatic talks in Turkey. Zelensky has tried desperately to hold his Western backers to Johnson's overblown promise, but short of direct U.S. and NATO military intervention, it seems that no quality of Western weapons can decisively break the stalemate in what has degenerated into a brutal war of attrition, fought mainly by artillery and trench and urban warfare. An American general bragged that the West has supplied Ukraine with 600 different weapon systems, but this itself creates problems. For example, 105 gun, the different 105 millimeter guns sent by the UK, France, Germany, and the US all use different shells. And each time heavy losses force Ukraine to reform survivors into new units, many of them have to be retrained on weapons and equipment they've never used before. Leaked Pentagon document? Despite the U.S. deliveries of at least 6 types of anti-aircraft missiles, Stingers, NASAMS, Hawk, RIM-7, Avenger, and at least 1 Patriot missile battery, a leaked Pentagon document revealed that Ukraine's Russian-built S-300 and Buk anti-aircraft systems still make up almost 90% of its main air defenses. NATO countries have searched their weapons stockpile for all the missiles they can provide for those systems, but Ukraine has nearly exhausted those supplies, leaving its forces nearly vulnerable to Russian airstrikes just as it prepares to launch its new counterattack. Since at least June 2022, Biden and other U.S. officials have acknowledged that the war must end in a diplomatic settlement and have insisted that they are arming Ukraine to put it, quote, in the strongest possible position at the negotiating table, end quote. Until now, they have claimed that each new weapon systems they have sent and each Ukrainian counteroffensive have contributed to that goal and left Ukraine in a stronger position. But the leaked Pentagon documents and recent statements by U.S. and Ukrainian officials make it clear that Ukraine's planned spring offensive, already delayed into summer, would lack the previous element of surprise and encounter stronger Russian defenses than the offensives that recovered some of its lost territory last fall. One leaked Pentagon document warned that, quote, enduring Ukrainian deficiencies in training and munition supplies probably will strain progress and exacerbate casualties during the offensive, end quote, concluding that it would probably make smaller territorial gains than the fall of offensives did. How can a new offensive with mixed results and higher casualties put Ukraine in a stronger position at a currently non-existing negotiating table? If the offensive reveals that even huge quantities of Western military aid have failed to give Ukraine military superiority or reduce its casualties to a sustainable level, it could very well leave Ukraine in a weaker negotiating position instead of a stronger one. Meanwhile, offers to mediate peace talks have been pouring in from countries all over the world, from the Vatican to China to Brazil. It has been 6 months since the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, suggested publicly, after Ukraine's military gains last fall, that the moment had come to negotiate from a position of strength. When there is an opportunity to negotiate, when peace can be achieved, seize it, he said. It would be doubly or triply tragic if, on top of the diplomatic failures that led to the war in the first place, and the US and UK undermining peace negotiations in April 2022, the chance for diplomacy that Milley wanted to seize is lost in the forlorn hope of attaining an even stronger negotiating position that is not really achievable. If the US persists in backing the plan for a Ukrainian offensive, instead of encouraging Zelensky to seize the moment for diplomacy, it will share considerable responsibility for the failure to seize the chance for peace and for the appalling and ever-rising human cost of this war. The experts who signed the New York Times statement recalled that in 1997, 50 senior U.S. foreign policy experts warned President Bill Clinton that expanding NATO was a policy error of historic proportions, and that unfortunately Clinton chose to ignore the warning. Biden, who is now pursuing his own policy error of historic proportions by prolonging this war, would do well to take the advice of today's policy experts by helping to forge a diplomatic settlement and making the United States a force for peace in the world. And this is on Zero Hedge by Tyler Durden. It's by Consortium News. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.